Hello, hello. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. My name is Mike Ansari. I'm the CEO of Heart4Iran. And today we're being joined by some amazing guests. We're going to be talking about is Western theology a threat to the indigenous church of Iran or the church in the East? But before I get started, I would like to thank you for joining us. Heart4Iran is a multinational ministry focused on bringing the gospel to the people of Iran, the Farsi speakers of Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. Our goal is to see the Great Commission take place in the region. We've been doing webinars since the start of pandemic, March of 2020, every month, and we're getting together to be able to connect with you guys and share with you what is happening with the pulse of God's work in Iran. And these programs are also placed as podcasts on various podcast platforms. So if you're listening to our podcast, we would like to thank you for joining us and encourage you to listen to the other series as well. At this moment where we're recording this program, it is the 30th of July of 2021. Iran is going through a major turmoil. There are deadly repressions of Khuzestan protests where the water is shut down on people. So from here, we would like to send our support to multitude of Iranians who are being persecuted and they are being marginalized and repressed because of the fact that they don't have any water. We ask you to pray for and continue your prayers for Iran. Without any further ado, allow me to introduce our guest to you, and we're excited to be here with you. Today, my co-host is my good friend and colleague Edwin Keshish Abnus, who is the author of Islam and Trinity, and also he is author of Lord's Prayer, a commentary. These books are all on Amazon, so please go ahead and take a look and make sure you take a look at them and purchase them. Also, Edwin serves as the managing producer of Mohabbat TV. We also have two wonderful guests joining us at this hour. And we are being joined by Reverend Roy Oxnevad. He is the EFCA All People's Director of Immigrant Mission. He's also the author of 3 books: Journey to Jesus, The Burden of Baggage, and also The Gospel for Islam. It is a joy to have you with us, Dr. Roy. And also we are being joined by Dr. Sosan Tawassoli, who is no stranger to Heart4Iran and Heart4Iran webinars. Dr. Sosan Tawassoli is a pastor and theologian. He is a pastor of Mohabbat TV's virtual church platform, where he brings live virtual church experience to isolated Iranian believers across Iran and diaspora. He is also the author of a book, Christian Encounters with Iran. So we have a high caliber program today, high caliber guests with us. And I would like to ask my co-host Edwin Abnus to go ahead and take it from here. Edwin, go ahead, and why don't you tell our audience what we're looking at today, what we're going to discuss today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm very happy to be with you guys, with Dr. Tawassoli, Dr. Oxnevad. I've known you, Sasanjan, for many, many years, and I had the privilege of talking and speaking to you, Roy, for past couple of years. Read your book, and we talked of your book in our shows. So it's such a great time to talk to you in this webinar. So we want to talk about Western theology. We want to talk about, is Western theology a threat to Iranian church? But before getting into the questions that we'll be asking today in this webinar, allow me to explore a little bit more. This is very a basic introduction to the terms of Western theology and what we mean by that. So what we mean here essentially are 2 things. First, we're talking about theological perspectives that was dominant on the Western part of the Roman Empire and the tradition of the church fathers like Ignatius, Augustine, Tertullian. You guys know them, whose thoughts have shaped the theology of the modern Western world. So one side of the question is basically what we're trying to ask is, how does this Western theology engage with the Iranian world? Do we have to engage the Iranian church filtering out theology through our denominational commitments, whether it is Western theology or Eastern theology or any tradition for that matter that is not common to the region? Why can't we not invest in development of the theology of the region? So And we all are presupposing that we want to pursue the truth. So whatever theology that would come out of that region has to be adhering to the truth. So we all are on the same page. We also want to touch on the Western culture and worldview of innocent and guilt of the Western world, and the worldview of shame and honor of Middle East. You may agree with me that these two worldviews can be filters or lenses through which we engage with the world and also with the Word of God. So we also, besides that question that I raised earlier, we want to explore this question as well. How does the worldview of innocence and guilt inform Western church in its relation to the indigenous church? This aspect of the question, the second part of the question I just raised, I think it touches a lot on the practical aspect of our conversation. Mike, with this quick introduction to the term Western theology, I'd like to pass the microphone to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, this is an exciting topic. Again, is Western theology a threat to the indigenous church of Iran? Let's go ahead and talk about, to better understand this, I want to pose a question to either one of you guys. What is the difference between the church in the West versus the church in the East?
Well, let me jump in. First, I want to also bring a word of greetings to our audience today. I must say that your very title of this webinar is very controversial. I hope we don't miscommunicate our desires and intentions behind the topic today. When I was thinking about the very question you've posed, I thought, I came to faith in Christ through the ministry of American missionaries. I've received my theological education and training in the church in America. My support and encouragement comes from the church in America. My wife is an American Christian. So the church in America, the Western church, in my context of the West, has been the source of the greatest blessings of my life. But at the same time, we want to say that the church in Iran has reached a level of maturity and growth that as an Iranian Christian leader, we want to be viewed in this conversation with the church in America or the West as equal partners. Right. Not like a parent-child relationship, but an equal, we are all members of the body of Christ. We have the same Holy Spirit. We are also growing and learning. And so that's kind of the desire that's at least my agenda, my desire for
that's definitely our agenda too. You're absolutely correct, Susan. I do want to I do want to share real fast that what you said is great. Our goal was not to sensationalize. We bless the Western theology and Western church, but you're absolutely correct. Why don't you continue, please?
Yeah, but we can talk for hours about Western theology and Eastern theology, church and all that. But I want to just approach it from this angle for our audience today in America. That what I like to highlight in response to the question you've asked, Fariborz, is to bring to the attention of our American believers that there is a rich history of the church in the East, something that I even didn't know about, although I was educated for years in American seminaries. Years ago, a classic book came out by Phil Jenkins called The Lost History of Christianity, where the author documents the phenomenal impact of the Church of Persia. The Iranian Christians took the gospel to China. And the Chinese people called Christianity the Persian religion for the first 100 years of their encounter with the gospel, because Nestorian missionaries had taken the gospel to Iran. More recently, a book came out called A Multitude of All Peoples, Engaging Ancient Christianity's Global Identity by Vince Bantu. And for the first time, after all these years of my own studies, for the first time, I read about the fact that we had a church council in Iran, in the Persian Empire, in the early 5th century. And the thriving theological conversations and community and missional church experiences in the Persian Empire, something that I didn't know about. So the point is, yes, the church in the West has had its own context, its own political context, denominational context, theological emphasis. For example, the church in the West has been more focused on the legal view of analyzing Christian doctrines, the court image of how we are guilty before a holy God and how we are declared justified through the work of Christ on the cross. The Eastern Church, just one example, has been more of an emphasis on a mystical relationship with God.
Hmm.
And so that aspect of union with Christ, the spirituality of worship and church in the East, is kind of distinct from the approach to theology and the church in the West. And these things play themselves out in contemporary Christianity too. These are not just ancient historical issues. And so our request as an Iranian leader to the American audience is for the Western church to be more sensitive to that history, to that rich tradition, and to some of the themes and emphasis of our context. And again, to be equal conversation partners as brothers and sisters, as part of the family of God. Thank you.
Yeah, and sort of to pick up on that, one of the things I'd like to do is to talk about the history of where this theology has come from the first 1,000 years, from the Apostle Paul up until Anselm around 1000 AD. There was what is called the classical or the dramatic version or paradigm of the atonement, which was now expressed as Christ the Victor. And it was Satanward focused, because the ancient world was very much focused on the spirit world that was working in dealing with all of the things that you don't have answers to in life. Why a woman happens to be not able to give birth, or sickness within the family, or wanting success in their business. This was done by spirit world, and you had to appease them and address them. And this Christ the Victor theology was very much addressing this whole aspect of Christ gaining victory over Satan and the principalities and powers that are in the world. And then Anselm came along and discovered the scarlet thread through Scripture and said, okay, it's this Christ is this substitutionary atonement theory, which is very much viewed as a logical or more of a Godward focus. So then the Reformation happened, and it sort of picked up on this. And out of the Reformation, they came to the United States and the West, and that became the predominant view. And we had lost very much the sense of Christ the Victor. And this legal sense has been very much forming everything from the Romans Road to peace with God, to all of the gospel presentations that we have are built on this. And as I was working with Muslims, one of the questions I was really wondering with is, they're not understanding what I'm talking about. So I discovered this whole aspect of Christ the Victor. And when I shared it, I could remember one man saying, I've been going to church for 2 years. This is the first time I've understood the gospel.
Wow.
So in regards to sort of theology, there's also been a morphing of a different version, which is more of a subjective version of the atonement, where reconciliation and its family adoption into the family of God has really become important. And it is become more human-focused and man-focused in its theology. And a lot of the liberal theology has taken hold of this, but it's also given birth to the whole prosperity gospel, which has affected very much Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as within the Iranian church. So this version of theology is also sort of morphed. And I think that the differences of view of where we're coming from has very practical implications on how we present the gospel and how the people perceive from their own worldview of what's going on. So the church in the East and the church in the West are different, but I think that one of the important parts is the church in the East, the Orthodox Church, held on to the Christ the Victor theology. And it was the Western church that took the atonement thing. And when persecution came, it was the Western understanding of the atonement that they didn't have a real worldview in regards to persecution and the satanic things in the realms. And the church sort of left, missionaries left. And it's been the Eastern church that has remained and had a theology of this whole battle that's taking place. And I think that that's an important part of the distinction between the two and why one has survived and the other one has not.
So just to sum up your answer, and this is for our audience, people who are joining us today, thank you for joining us at this time again. We are talking about, is the Western theology a threat to the indigenous church in the East or Iran? The program is live. We encourage you to ask your questions or write your questions so we could ask our panelists the questions. But to sum up what was said, the question was the difference between church in the West and East. And our audience and our guest told us that, basically about a millennial before there was a church in the West, the church in the East was really the cradle of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And through that, Sosan was sharing with us that, the church, the Nestorian movement in Iran was very strong before there was even a Vatican. And they were sending missionaries to different places. But then what Roy is saying is because their model was Christ the victor, they managed to persevere through centuries of persecution, especially as of Genesis of Islam, where there was marginalization and eradication of Christian movement across the Middle East. The Eastern Church survived because they had the model of Christ the victor. So that is very, very insightful. Edwin, I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to you, brother.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me ask you, I want to bring up the same question that we started the webinar with, and I want to ask Dr. Oxenford this first, and then Sosan, I want you to continue in sharing your thoughts and contributing for these questions as well. So, Western theology or Western world has shaped throughout the centuries and has become whatever it is right now. It is dominant worldview and the theology that is deriving the church in United States and Europe. And we know that Western church and Europe has an active role in the growth of the Iranian church. Let me ask you this very first question we brought up. Is Western theology or Western church, there is a distinction between these two here, a threat to Iranian church?
I would say it's a great provocative statement, but I would say no, it's not a threat. One of the things that the Western church has been very focused in is knowledge and right belief, with the understanding that if you understand right theology, it then means it will produce right action. But we're finding out within the church of, the young church of Iran, that right theology, you can have the right theology and still not affect the way that the behavior is taking place within the church. So I think if the West continues to come in with this idea of right theology, good thinking will then produce great action, I think that, yes, it's definitely in a sense a threat because it's not addressing the root cause and the worldview that people have.
So, what do you think?
Well, first of all, as an Iranian American, I just want to poke a little bit my American friend Roy here. The problem of right theology doesn't automatically lead to right action. It's not just a problem in the Iranian church. You see the same thing in the American church. but to add to what just Roy said, I think, this is just a non-academic conversation we are having. I think all of us in the back of our mind, in addition to the word theology, we are also thinking about the word church and denominations. And this is all kind of part of this larger conversation we are having. And to make the discussion very practical, this is what I want to say in response to your question. No, I also don't believe that we need to view the West and East relationship as a threat. But the issue is asking our friends in the West, whether church leaders, mission agencies, donors, to think through the cause of the gospel in the context of Iran or the Middle East or the church in the East, not just through the lens of their own denominational tradition and denominational distinctives, but to say that the Bible is much bigger. Christian faith is much bigger than just our particular perspective. Like what Roy just gave a great example. In many of our denominations in the West, in my own seminary training, we never talked about spiritual warfare. We never talked about the reality of engaging with evil forces. Whereas in many parts of the world, that's a much more live conversation that's happening. If a denomination in America has particular distinctives about the role of women in ministry, about charismatic gifts, for example, about how you organize the church polity and the church structure, I think that what I want to say is many of those issues have been conditioned by a particular context in our own history and tradition. And let's not impose our interpretation and perspective on some of these issues that are not foundational to the Christian faith and say the church that we want to see grow in other parts of the world must be a replication of our model of the church. It should look like exactly what we believe and how we worship. And so that's the kind of invitation in these discussions for the church in the West to say, yes, God has given us a lot of gifts and knowledge and experience and history. Let's share that in a generous way with the younger generation of churches that are growing in the global South, including in the East and in a place like Iran. And let's have a more open-ended, open-hearted conversation with our partner churches in the East.
I'll give an example here.
Go
One theology professor had gone to Africa, and in his first worship service that he was there, he saw a woman actually levitate off the chair, float through the air up to the platform, and then came down. And he said from that point, his theology shifted. And he goes, no one ever told me this. And he had no idea what to do. And it was the Africans that knew what to do and how to deal with it. And he said, I had to learn at the feet of the African church how to deal with spirituality. When I was working, I can remember with this Iranian guy coming to me and saying, I had a dream. Could you tell me what it is? What God is saying to me. And I thought through my theology classes in seminary, and I said, I don't remember ever having a theology course on interpretation of dreams. And yet this is so much a part of the ethos in which the church is growing in, and we can learn at the feet of our brothers in regards to this other areas that our Western theology has not necessarily dealt in depth with.
That's a great.
Let me take this question to the next level. Now, first thing first, before I ask the next question, one of our audience members is saying, why are we using the term threat? This seems to set a harsh tone. Please explain. Sasan explained that in the beginning. We do not think that the Western theology is a threat, but there are some people that may use that word. We did not want to sensationalize. We just wanted to bring up a terminology that is being used, and we wanted to have an honest conversation and discussion about it. We do not believe that the Western theology is a threat to Iran, but we are also talking about the fact, as Sasan said, that sometimes there's this mindset that we're talking about a parent and a child. And sometimes that mentality could set the tone of dominance, which goes against the socio-political and geopolitical history of the region that we need to be sensitive about. I do want to ask the next question, and that is from either one of you guys. How do we respect the indigenous nature of Iranian church? Can you, because see, the idea is to start open and wide and have a general conversation, but the goal is to talk about Iran. Roy, I know that in your book you interviewed countless number of Iranians in their experience with Jesus. So you had a very, very good, vivid understanding of the worldview of the Iranian church. So, son, you have been ministering to the Iranian church for years, and you still are. So again, let me ask each one of you guys this question, and either one of you guys can answer this. And Edwin, you also have a lot of insight. I want to ask you to also share your feedback as well. We want to be blessed by your view as well. How do we respect the indigenous nature of Iranian church?
One of the things that I think is really important, we in the West have a scientific view of reality in which there's the forgotten middle of, it's just sort of a dual type of thing. There's heaven and then there's the underearth, the earth, the scientific part. And it affects the way that we worship. It affects the way that we interact with one another. And I think that this middle thing, this middle realm of spirituality, of really, I'll give you just one example. I was at a church and the worship was really wonderful. I looked around and nobody was raising their hands except for one couple. and they happened to be Iranian. And they were enthralled and totally into the worship service, whereas the other ones were just sort of singing. And when you go to an Iranian church, as well as if we could say even many of the two-thirds world churches, they are much more vibrant, much more passionate, much more excited in regards to the worship than what we see in the West. And I think that we need to respect, and we can learn from that. In fact, there are a number of people say that it is this two-thirds world that is going to revitalize the Western church. And I think that is one way that we can respect and learn from and sit at the feet of those that are coming in with a fresh view of the whole Christian experience.
I want to say something in a very frank and direct way, if you allow me. Many times, I think I want to address the heart issue of pride and arrogance that I hope in these conversations, and I'm not just saying this is a problem with the church in the West, we have our own issues in the East with pride and arrogance. But when a church comes from a tradition of knowledge, scientific thinking, theology, books, resources, and then money and finances, it's easy to say, we will only support people in a place like Iran who believe like us, who follow us, and we try to kind of plant our own flag, again, replicating ourselves in the West in a different context. So what I think the church in the West, the church that has a lot of resources, should view is truly like Philippians 2, Jesus emptying himself. And the church should say, this is our gift to the global church, but we also need to receive the gifts from the global church, from the Church of Iran, whether it's about spirituality, whether it's about persecution, whether it's a different emphasis on what Jesus accomplished on the cross, whether it's the reality of, spiritual warfare, healing, visions, the more experiential aspect of the Christian faith, and a host of other issues. And oftentimes, the gifts and the support from the Western church can have that string attached, which is not healthy to a young, vibrant church. Can we trust that? I was talking to one of my colleagues who has a deep knowledge about the church in China. And from the very beginning of the 20th century, the Chinese Christian leaders started saying, listen, all these Western denominations have come and planted their denominations in China, but these are not contextual Chinese churches. Yeah. And we need to move to a post-denominational world where this is more about the Protestant church in China, where we all are committed to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. So we commit to the foundational convictions of all Christians throughout history, but we allow our own context and culture to shape how we worship, how we direct our church leadership and denominational stuff. And within that umbrella, you can have your denominational distinctives. You can be a Presbyterian, you can be even a Seventh-day Adventist. Obviously, cults like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are not part of that. But so I'm not against having your own tradition be part of this growing church movement in Iran. I'm a Presbyterian pastor. But to say, I only support people who think and act exactly like me and my denominational traditional distinctives, I think that's the conversation we need to have. Can we be generous with our love, with our support, with our friendship from the Western church without wanting to dictate and control, but allow the Spirit of God to lead our brothers and sisters in Iran and allow the Spirit of God to teach us from our brothers and sisters in Iran and the global church, what the church in America needs to learn. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a book that really deals with this, it's called Globalizing Theology, Belief and Practice in an Era of World Christianity by Craig Ott and Harold Nettman. It is saying exactly what you have said, Sasan, in regards to we need to listen, we need to hear, and we need to not come with the arrogance of the West that we have. And they particularly talk about theology and writing. And on an academic level, it has still not been very good in accepting a lot of people that are in the two-thirds world writing theology?
I want to give a specific example, and Fariborjan, I will be quiet after that. Somewhere in the Middle East, I'm not going to mention the country, lots of churches in the area. I went to a church led by an American pastor. Hardly anybody in the congregation was American. They were from all around the world. The worship style was very much like you would see in Middle America, no different than, not at all sensitive to the context in the Middle East. And then after the service, we met with the pastor, American pastor in the Middle East, in a city and an area with lots of other churches from around the world. He said, nobody here was preaching the gospel, so we had to parachute down and start this church. Wow. Now, this is an area with a rich history of Christianity and lots of churches, evangelical churches. But this American brother said, nobody's preaching the gospel, so we had to parachute down. That's an attitude that I want us to push back against. That you don't have the gospel. You don't need to parachute down. You need to come and listen with humility to what the Spirit of God has been doing in this area, and have that equal status of friendship and partnership, that we have come to rescue you, and we only know the truth, and we can, and we will only support those who will just listen to us and obey us. Yeah.
Brothers, I really enjoy this conversation. I hope this can continue for many weeks. Mike, please consider this topic for future webinars as well. This has been the passion of my heart for a long time. Well, I want to go back again and re-emphasize the fact that we are not criticizing the Western theology. We are looking at, I'm a product of Western world, Western theology. I've been educated here. I've been teaching whatever I have learned from the denomination I was committed to follow. But we're trying to have a conversation. We're trying to understand the strength and also the weaknesses of both perspectives. But let me ask another question. And Susan, I want to address this question to you. Many years ago, I read a book. It was called 3D Gospel, in which he was talking about how we understand the gospel through the lens of our worldviews, our culture, innocent and guilt, shame and honor, and fear and power. And I believe this has been many years ago, if I can remember this correctly, the author was saying all three perspectives, all three approaches to the gospel is legitimate perspectives that you can find in the Bible. And the reality is, when it comes to engaging the word, we also bring in these worldviews principles, these values, these scientific mind, or these legal language that we really are interested in West, to understand and interpret anything that we, the data of the gospel, the word, and then we teach that as the truth. But the other side of the fact is, we have a blind side because we do not see the way our brothers and sisters who adhere to shame and honor culture or power and fear culture, and we don't understand the way they see it. Do we have to educate ourselves when it comes to the Iranian culture? Do we need to understand shame and honor culture, their principles, their values, the way they see the word and interpret the word and the word through their eyes, and or this Western cookie cutter approach will suffice it because we just have a these scientific, for the lack of a better word, or the legal terms that we really keen out?
I actually think Roy needs to address this question. I will be very brief. Roy has done some phenomenal thinking on this, but I think the bottom line is, are we as ambassadors of the gospel communicating to the heart and mind of our audience? The gospel has to be translated. The church translated the gospel from day one, from Aramaic to Greek, and then to other languages and cultures. And Roy gave a great example. You can give a particular articulation of the gospel that will be heard in one context and will not be heard and understood in a different context. We just need to understand that. And in parts of the world where we are dealing with Like, again, as you know, in the many Iranians I've dealt with, in their heart of hearts, when you present the gospel through just the Western Protestant Reformed tradition, that you have been declared justified in the divine court, it doesn't touch their heart. It doesn't touch their soul. It does not have the transformational impact in their lives that we think it has. Whereas when you talk about Jesus can conquer all your fears and give you victory against the dark forces, Jesus covers your shame in glory and honor with the embrace of the Father. That communicates to the heart of the audience in a way that the verdict has been declared that you are not guilty, but you are in the imputed righteousness of Christ has been imputed to your account. It might have stirred Calvin's heart, but I'm not sure it stirs the heart of a contemporary Iranian. And so that's I think, what you're getting at. And I would love to hear more from Roy's insights on us being sensitive to the ways that the Word of God is so rich and multidimensional that we shouldn't just impose our one perspective on it as the only perspective that needs to be taught and communicated. So, Roy, please.
Let me just talk about one area, conflict with honor and shame. Western assumption is that conflict is positive. Middle Eastern is that conflict is negative and dangerous. It's shameful. We think that conflict is normal in the Western perspective, and the other one, it's something that has to be avoided because it's so shameful. You don't talk about it, you hide it. We look in conflict and we say that it brings growth and creativity from a Western perspective, and that's the way we teach. Whereas the other ones would say it brings destruction and disorder. It messes things up, and therefore you don't talk about it. We talk about collaborative, cooperative frameworks that are essential components in regards to conflict resolution, coming from a legalistic point of view of the way it's structured. Where the other one is family, clan, religion, sect, group affiliation. And the most central part is you've got to protect the family. You've got to protect everybody else that's involved in the whole thing, in opposing to the other person. So just in regards to thinking of, legal, well, we just understand this way of, you put these 10 principles in place and everything's fine. But the assumption is that this one worldview is the one that's going to affect change in this other worldview, when it really doesn't. Actually comes at it from a totally different perspective. So conflict there is just sort of to get conflict to work together. Western sense, you have to have a plan, whereas the Middle Eastern sense would be you've got to have somebody as a mediator who comes in and works on this, because the honor and the shame of the conflict, you have to protect your honor. You can't let loose that you are saying, I was wrong. If you did that, then all the guilt goes onto you. So there's this sense of, we've got to understand that, very practically, worldview and the way that we assume various things will have very different consequences, and we can't come in just with one kind of teaching from one theological perspective and say that this is a cookie cutter type of thing and it works universally.
This is powerful. We're getting a lot of questions coming. I'm going to start asking those questions from you guys. I do want to go ahead and touch on something. So some mentioned that sometimes there's a bit of an arrogance from West towards the East. I do want to mention that there's also arrogance sometimes from the East towards the West. I have seen among some Persian pastors or leaders, Christian leaders, that they say, look, I know what I'm doing. I don't need the West to tell me what to do. I'm coming from a civilization of 2,500 years history, and I know how to handle the conflict and other things. We have had a lot of situations where arrogance also stems from the Eastern Church, from the indigenous leaders as well. What I'm getting here, and I want to share with the audience, is that what is being said is there needs to be a bridge of communication. Through that, conflict is fine, but understanding worldviews and cultures allows us to build a lasting road of communication among each other. I want to go ahead and start asking some of the questions that our audience are asking you guys. And let me go ahead over here with a question. It says, what is preliminary denomination? Protestant, Methodist. Today, some of these denominations are leading source of false teachings. Your thoughts? This is a question that came up. Maybe this goes hand in hand with the previous questions. It says, from another person, it says, I believe that filters are both organic in us and inorganic imposed by others. How do denominations, sects, and movements impede your work? I think these two questions can be probably answered together. Short answers from either one of you guys. Edwin, also, if you have any answers to these questions, love to hear from you.
Short answer, historically, the three Protestant denominations in Iran were the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, and the Assemblies of God, which started in Iran itself. This is all prior to the revolution. Those denominations really do not have much of a presence. Right now, we just have a loose movement of, a house church movement in Iran. A lot of our church buildings have been shut down and the properties have been confiscated. I think, to be more accurate, when we're talking about denominational influence, is again, the money in Western agencies, the Western churches and denominations, and the way they want to influence and shape their ministries among Iranians. That's the issue. It's not like we have officially church buildings with denominational affiliations happening in Iran. And some of these groups are even just Iranian agencies and groups and organizations that have created this kind of a competition and rivalry just because of theological affiliation. So that spirit of division and territorialness is, I think, what we need to address and be concerned about. But that's what I wanted to say to the first question.
Roy?
And I have in two specific instances, and this was in regards to the West rather than in country in Iran. The Iranian church was housed in renting facilities from this one denomination. And the response was, we need to get our theology into these people.
Yeah.
Nothing in regards to, basic theology, biblical doctrine. It was our unique theology needs to be brought into them so that they can be more like us.
They have to carry our flag. They have to carry our label. Otherwise, we won't support them or we won't provide space for them. Yeah, exactly. That's a typical attitude. Yes.
Yeah.
Powerful. There are more questions coming in. Edwin, did you want to take a jab at this one, or you want to go to the next question?
I think the most of the answer has been given, but the reality is, yes, where the money comes from, that is the dictation, basically. That is the direction set by. I mean, the intention is good. We don't want to misrepresent the missionaries. We misrepresent the organizations and foundations that are helping. We are really grateful. If the Western Church and the agencies and those churches were not here, the Iranian church would not experience the growth that we are experiencing now. That is not what it is. That we're not talking about this is bad. We welcome this contribution. We welcome this partnership. The question is, how can we partner together? This is my question basically to you both. How does the Western Church and the Iranian church partner together? Can we see each other as equal partners in these mission fields?
Yeah, and I go back to humility, really. If the gifts are being offered in a spirit of humility and generosity, and if the recipients, like in this case, Iranian ministries and churches, also respond with humility and generosity and share the gifts we have, I think that communication that Mike was talking about can be established on a healthy basis. But if the attitude is, we have the money, we have the books, we have the seminaries, we have the training resources, so here, you do this and you will be successful like us, obviously that is not a healthy relationship. And one of the reality is, and Roy can speak more to this, the fact is that even in the West and even in America, denominational distinctives are kind of in decline. And attendance in denominational churches is in decline. So again, I don't want us to think just about the classical labels of denomination, but again, it can be a ministry. It can be a pastor of a mega church. It can be a famous Christian TV preacher. But again, to come with the attitude that because we have the experience and knowledge and resources, we need to dictate and control. That's, I think, what we are talking about, that there needs to be a different heart and attitude in this partnership between the church in the West and the church in Iran.
Roy, can I tweak the question a little bit for you?
Sure.
The reality is when the foundation, when a ministry, when a church contributes financially, at the end of the day, these contribution needs to be measured. They want to see if there's a return in this investment. They want to see if that is effective in the church, in the indigenous Church of Iran. And because of that, they have certain criteria in mind. And that criteria is put them in a box that is really not flexible. Do you think, based on the strategy and the model that is already all these organizations are running on, do you think it is a realistic hope to see that that humble contribution or contributing in humility, the way that Dr. Sassani is saying, will happen anytime soon?
In regards to, say, in your institutions, seminaries, particularly in the missions department, there is a strong emphasis and recognition that denominationalism, as we have known it in the past, is really changed because we no longer are just Western people in the United States. In fact, the world has come to us, and it's not us going to the world. It is now we are a part of the world. And I think that if the church and institutions recognize that there has been a major shift in which the world has been going all over the place, and we are no longer one kind of worldview, but we are a multiple worldview. And for us to be effective, we're going to have to change from just one particular way of doing things that we've done in the past. We've had to open that up with much more open arms, because I'm teaching a theology course in which I have 2 Iranians, Nigerian and African American in the course. And I have to be sensitive to each one of the worldviews and what the sensitivities that they have, so that in my own teaching that I'm addressing each one of those rather than just saying, here's the one thing that we need to go with. So the world has changed. And if we're going to be in touch and be most effective in this world, we have to let go of our unique distinctives and say that we've got to work together because we are no longer just one.
Roy, one of the things that is really become that has been coming to my mind recently more and more, and I would love to see the role of the Western Church and Western support in this, is I am, as an Iranian Christian leader, I want to hear more and more from leaders in China, from leaders in North Korea, from leaders in Africa, Latin America, India, Central Asia. And the church in the West, instead of just thinking about the West versus Iran, the church in the West, I think, can have a phenomenal impact at this stage in its history and mission to facilitate those global conversations. So it's not just a two-way relationship, East and West, but again, the whole world is involved in this. As the whole world has come to America, and the West has gone to the whole world, and facilitating global conversations so we can all learn from each other. I have become a lot more interested now in listening to leaders from the global church than leaders just from the West, which has been my experience all these years so far. So I hope that even as a result of this conversation, some of the people watching this listening to this podcast or watching us right now live, that can become we can move towards facilitating a global conversation for the global church.
Sasan, over here, I would like to interject and share with you that with our audience, and also if there are ministry leaders listening to this, the point that Sasan is talking about is extremely critical. Before we would think that we're reaching out to the Eastern Christians in the Middle East, but the vast majority of people who are not responding to the gospel are people who are converting from Islam to Christianity. We call them MBPs or BMBs, however you want to refer to them, Muslim background believers. reaching out to them is extremely important, and being able to embrace them and embrace their culture and worldview is critical. I do want to go ahead, as we're getting close. We have 10 minutes left in the program. Roy, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they get in touch with you? And also your books, you have authored 3 books. If they wanted to get their hands on their books, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
The Burden of Baggage, First Generation Issues in Coming to Christ, that is both on Amazon as well as William Carey Publishing. I've written a curriculum in regards to how to witness to Muslims, how to reach out to Muslims, and that is called Journey to Jesus, Building Christ-Centered Friendships or Relationships with Muslims, and that you can find through Next Step Resources, and that should be up there. So that's one way to get a hold of me. And then it's my email address would be roy.oxnavad@efca.org.
Thank you, Roy. Pastor Sosan, I know that you are handling and running and ministering through the virtual church of Mohabbat TV. And can you tell us more? What is the best way for people to have a glance at what God is doing in Iran and perhaps connect with you?
Well, if you want to come and see the Iranians from around the world gather every week, Thursday, 12:30 U.S. East Coast time, every Thursday, we gather in our virtual church. The website address is mykelisa.com. Kelisa, K-E-L-I-S-A, mykelisa.com. Kelisa is the word for church, so it's mychurch.com. And we have Iranians from Iran and around the world coming to our live worship service. It can also be participated through YouTube or Facebook. We also have Afghan believers join us, and we have a worship leader maybe in Turkey, the congregational pastors in London, a preacher can be in the US or preaching from Germany. So it is truly a global church of Iranians and Afghans using this virtual platform to worship Christ and be enriched from the truth of Scripture. So it's an exciting opportunity for you to get a glimpse of what's going on in the Iranian world. mykelisa.com every Thursday afternoon, 12:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Standard Time.
And at this moment, I do want to go ahead and encourage our listeners and our viewers to visit our website at heart4iran.com and what God is doing through the virtual platform. We are not replacing the classic church, the biblical sense of church. It's basically a bridge to be able to connect the isolated and highly persecuted believers to come together in fellowship in Christ, where Pastor Sasan and Pastor Amir are leading us. So please make sure you join us, and we appreciate your support of this platform. There are ways that you can get behind God's work and see how you can go ahead and support what God is doing among the Iranian millennials and Gen Zs that are afraid to come across because of persecution. Iran remains as the 8th most dangerous country to be a follower of Jesus, my friends. In Iran, having a Bible is illegal. Fellowship in an open sense is forbidden, yet the church is growing fast. And I think the topic that we discussed today demonstrates the importance of creating lasting bridges and communications. We bless the church in the West, we bless the church in America, in Europe, and we thank you for the legacy they're leaving behind, and we're hoping that there would be a healthy connection. Edwin, I wanted to ask you, you also have authored a couple of books, and if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to connect with you?
The best way, I believe, is to check my website. It's edwinoknus.org. It's my first name and the second portion of my long last name. You were talking about your long last name, Mike. Mine, I think it is. You can't beat that. And I really thank both of you, Sasan and Roy, for your contribution. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And Roy, I want to thank you in particular for your contribution to Iranian church, especially your book. Sometimes, I mean, I am witnessing the growth of Iranian church, and sometimes we are so deep into the ministry that we miss the forest for tree. But you sit back and look back, from back and see the entire picture, and going back to your research and encounter with Iranians gives us a very good insight of what we're doing and readjusting our approach to the ministry. I want to thank you, Susana, as well for your tireless contribution to the Iranian church, and I'm glad that I can be serving God with you, along with you and Mike and everybody else in Heart4Iran.
Guys, we have not done justice discussing this topic, because this topic can be discussed, as Edwin said, months at the end. And we would like to go ahead and invite our friends for next month. Next month, we are going to be talking about between East and West, the relationship between East and West. What can we learn from each other? A question came earlier from one of our viewers, one of our friends of the ministry, Atif, who asked about some examples in other churches in other regions where we could learn from, and we wanted to let you know, please join us. Save the date, Friday, August 27th at same time, which is 12 p.m. Washington time. We would like to ask you to join us. Tell your friends if this is a conversation and a dialogue that you enjoy and maybe you learn something from, or you would like to contribute to. We would love to learn from each other. I want to ask our panelists just to share. We have 4 more minutes left, but can you share your last words, maybe a couple of sentences to sum up your view and your position on this? We would love to hear from you. This is your chance. Why don't we go ahead and start with Roy, and then Sasan, and then Edwin.
I would say that one of the things that David Woodbury has looked at, just had a remarkable, Robert Woodbury did an entire study on the impact of missionaries in the two-thirds world. And his research has shown that it has been the West that really has promoted democracy and has changed a lot of cultures, because they brought the gospel of Christ, and not just social concerns or other concerns, but they brought the gospel. And I say that we need to continue to do that in what's one of the best ways that we can continue to support the church in Iran and others, by bringing Christ, not necessarily our cultural understandings.
What I want to say again, what I said earlier, everything I am and everything I have learned, for the most part, is from the church in the West. So I owe a deep gratitude to all the people that have taught me, encouraged me, prayed for me, supported me, invested in me. But what we want to communicate, as I see the church in Iran growing and Iranian leaders rising up and thinking deeply about our context of ministry, I would like to see us as the Iranian church learn more about our own history and be allowed to think contextually about our own world, about our own priorities, about the way we want to express, articulate the Christian faith, without thinking that an older brother is watching over us and trying to control those conversations. So that's kind of what I want to communicate, that it's time for us to, in the spirit of freedom, equal partnership, and generosity, to have a more holistic approach to East-West cooperation.
Yeah, I long for a day, to see a day that we can have a constructive conversation together. I think God has created every single one of us very differently and uniquely positioned us in different countries. And we all have our own unique way of understanding and our own unique voices that is worth hearing, to be heard. And I hope one day we can get together and learn from each other, hear each other, and glorify Christ together. And thank you again, Roy. Thank you again, Sasan, for your amazing contribution.
Folks, thank you so much for joining us. A lot is happening in Iran. Iran is in the news. We encourage you to come and follow us on our Twitter. Join us. I try to usually put the latest information about the struggles in Iran and also the persecution from Iran. You could follow me on Twitter at, my handle is at Mike_Ansari. And we thank all the people who have watched our program through either Vimeo, Facebook, YouTube, or other platforms. These events are going to be archived on Heart4Iran.com. Sign up for newsletter if you have not. Share the news with others. If you have people in your circle that need to have a heart for Iran, ask them to come and join us. We bless you. We thank you. To our panelists, it's been a pleasure. We're not done. We're just scratching the surface. There's so much that we could learn from each other. Edwin, it's been a pleasure to work with you. Folks, The idea is that there's no threat. Let's go ahead and communicate and create bridges of respect, love, and open communication. That's how we're going to be able to achieve the Great Commission. With this final thought, we bless you, and we hope you would join us next month at our next webinar at the end of August. Have a wonderful evening.